I'm Connor Old and welcome back to another episode of the Top 10 of the 2010s, and this video is solely dedicated to my number one Western of the decade, the number one pick on my Top 10 Westerns of the decade list, which is True Grit.
I will kill this girl!
Biggest mistake you ever made.
Tell him that God's gonna cut you down.
An amazing movie and one of the Coen's best works, in my opinion. I think it's a movie that at first glance seems to be a pretty traditional movie, one that maybe lacks some of the Coen Brothers elements on that first watch, but I think with multiple rewatches and with hindsight and looking back on the movie, it is clear to me that it is actually more than just a traditional linear story, that it actually does fit into the Coen Brothers filmography very nicely. It has some of these tropes, but just leans into some of the other ones, especially during this time that they're focused on. And I think that if you think it's just a simple linear story, maybe a middling Coen's, you haven't seen it either enough times or you weren't looking hard enough the first time through. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is I talk about some of my favorite movies of the decade. This episode is going to be solely dedicated to True Grit because that's how the structure of the series works. Essentially, I start with a new genre. I give my picks from 10 to 7 in one week, including some honorable mentions. The next week, I talk about my picks from 6 to 2, and then a full video on what my favorite romance movie is, or in this case, my favorite Westerns. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. These videos come out every Monday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. It's also notable that I have timestamps in the descriptions, so especially for those 10 to 7 episodes or 6 to 2, you can jump around and just hear what I like to say about certain movies based on the thumbnail that you see. I also want to mention that next week we're going to be starting a new genre, and that's going to be the horror genre, so I hope you stay tuned and watch that. But without further ado, I like to jump into True Grit and what really makes this interesting film and really work as a great pick as in context with this list as a number one Western of this decade, because it's one, I think if we're looking at our entire list, the entire list I've done so far, and generally the most popular and most decade-defining Westerns of this decade, we find some commonalities. One being the sort of auteur-driven, where the Western genre is kind of dead in the sense that it's not as popular as it once was in, say, the 50s. It's still sort of regulated a genre, so it often requires these auteurs like a Coen Brothers or a Quentin Tarantino to make them, and we often saw these auteur-driven Western films, and those are the Westerns that we got. So the Coen sort of True Grit here fits in nicely in that sense. So it's got that an auteur body of the Western that we saw this decade. Now it's also got, I think, both the realist and heroic elements that we saw in this decade as well, where the heroic elements were movies like Rango or The Lone Ranger, which were more traditional with the 50s classic Westerns. It also has some of the realist elements, which started, like I said, in the very first episode with Unforgiven, and then how that sort of spawned off into the anti-hero revisionist Western. I think that it has some of these characters that are very, they aren't maybe the traditional heroic figures, but that doesn't mean they don't do heroic things, that it still has sort of the traditional linear narrative, yet it is imbued with a lot of these realist elements of actually how they would be, or how they'd smell, or how they act, and the sort of morality and attitudes of these characters, particularly with someone like Rooster Cogburn. So the way I want to sort of structure this conversation around True Grit is sort of go from the beginning and see what most people enjoy from the movie from the first watch, and then subsequently with subsequent rewatches what I sort of discovered, and more of the spiritual elements of the film and more of the a little bit more metaphorical elements of the film that I garnered and gained after multiple rewatches that I think are very obvious there, which is why I say, give this movie a rewatch, check it out again, because there is some deepness to it. It is not just the traditional box office hit to the Coen Brothers career, that it is something a little bit more than that. But so starting off at the very sort of surface level, which is the performances. The first time, I think everyone's pretty much blown away and really impressed by Jeff Bridges' interpretation of Rooster Cogburn. Now, True Grit, based on the Charles Portier novel, but it was also remade into a film in 1969 with John Wayne, so this is the Coens' second remake of their career. And it's a film that is very sort of iconic in John Wayne's career, especially his sort of twilight years, and it's a good movie. I've seen it, I enjoyed it, so why remake it if you've already had such a great remake, and what can you do to do differently? And the same way I would say Heath Ledger does something different with the Joker than say Jack Nicholson's version Jeff Bridges does here. He very much falls a little bit more closer to the book, as I was told, and where John Wayne is sort of adding his John Wayne-ness, his sort of flawlessness, his sort of idyllic version of a hero, and what John Wayne is. He's less so Rooster Cogburn and more John Wayne. Jeff Bridges really embodies this sort of grumbly, smelly, you can almost smell him, sort of dirty sheriff who sort of grumbles and stumbles and mumbles throughout his life, and is lacking motivation, and you can barely hear what he says at certain times, but he's sort of just grumpily going along. And Jeff Bridges really embodies that, whether it just be his body movement. I mean, the production design and costume design really help him in terms of just the stains and the ratters and the tats and the way he's living. I mean, we really get a sense of this guy who's just kind of always on the road and not really settled down, and it looks more comfortable sometimes on a horse with all of his sort of jackets on and his hat and his long beard, and he's a man in the wilderness, but yet he's sort of this man who looks like maybe a modern day hobo, but yet he's such a man of powerful esteem and of power, because he's of course a U.S. Marshal. Haley Steinfeld as the young preppy Maddie is great, as someone who's whipped smart and sometimes can be annoying and very confrontational, but charming in doing so because of her sort of singular revenge plot, and that's the sort of tunnel vision that she does have. And then we have, the side characters, someone like Matt Damon as LaBeef, or Ned Pepper, played by Barry Pepper. These are guys who aren't necessarily good or bad. There's a little bit in between. Then Ned Pepper and his gang are just outlaws, but they don't really want to get into this area, and they do care for the girl, and they want to try to make the intelligent, logical decision. And then someone like Matt Damon's LaBeef, he's a hero, supposedly he's on our side, but he has constant friction with Rooster. He sort of wants to do it his own way, but he still has an immense loyalty to Maddie and Rooster. Now, the film is linear and more typical Hollywood than, say, a traditional Coen Bros film, where they're more interested in maybe a complex mystery or someone searching for something, or just a traditional day in the life. This is pretty traditional revenge linear story that we've seen so many times in Hollywood, yet I still think it is a Coen Brothers film, particularly because of themes that run across all of their work, but very much seen here in an elevated sense, because there's themes of, I think, morbidity and melancholy. Melancholy in the sense that Maddie, Haley Steinfeld's character, is sort of looking for justice, looking for revenge, looking for sort of a fairness in the world, and is looking to these sort of pseudo-father figures. And who does she get? What's the closest thing she can get to someone who will just barely help her? Is, of course, Rooster Cogburn and LaBeef, that these sort of bickering guys who are narcissistic and will turn back at any chance. These are guys that are the best you can sort of get. So there's a sort of melancholy that this is sort of the best hope, that this is the best you can get. The morbidity of just the barren, bleak landscape that they go into once they go past the town. That the Western is such a unique genre, because there's these insular towns, but you go 2 miles out and you're in a completely different landscape, and you're totally disconnected from any sort of society, and it's a land of lawlessness. And morbidity because we see deadness and the morbidity of the situation. We see all dead trees, pretty much. There's very little live trees. There's dead people. There are people carrying dead furs. I mean, death is sort of a common theme throughout. I mean, they're going to kill someone. Why? Because of death. It's sort of a whole motivation, which is something that I think links a lot of the Coen's westerns. We talked about Ballad of Buster Scruggs last episode. That's very much also interested in death, but this one is more interested in death, I think, less confrontationally than Ballad of Buster Scruggs, and less the relationship to it, but more about how it can sort of consume you and sort of be a singular focus. Now, I think that Maddie entering this sort of land, we'll say this barren land, going onto this journey, crossing the river, that there's some symbolic kind of metaphorical things where you would interpret it in terms of a lot of ways. You can interpret it into her going into adulthood, and that's sort of the future, that there's death in the future, and then that's sort of the way she'll be eventually going, in a sort of a scary place with no heroes and no one to show you the way. There's one great scene that I think is a standout for me, where Maddie and Rooster come upon a man who's hung really high on a dead tree, and she asks, why is he hung so high? And Rooster doesn't know, of course, because that man is just sort of a part of the landscape, that nobody knows his story. Was he right? Was he just? We don't know who tied him up there. We don't know. Did he deserve it? We don't know, and we won't know. And that's just sort of the reality of the situation of death and the sort of meaninglessness of it in this sort of one point. Now, you could mention, like I said, you could mention in terms of the adulthood metaphor, but I think you could also very much interpret it as I do for the most part, which is, I think, maybe not the correct interpretation, but the most common interpretation and most obvious and most blatant elements of the film, which I think the spiritual elements of the film is particularly if you have sort of a knowledge of the Christian faith, and which the Coen brothers don't. They're Jewish, but they very much have this, throughout their films, they have a Old Testament morality, meaning that their laws of the world, rules of the world are strict, that no one gets away empty-handed, that there's no excuses. No one gets an excuse, oh, because my father died, that I can now kill, that there's still these rules of the law, and they're very strict to a certain extent. That this movie and the Western genre is so interested with laws and morality and doing just, and that there's the laws of the land, meaning the laws that maybe humans will make up and enforce, that yes, if one man kills another man, then we have to go bring justice and kill that other man, kind of an attitude. Yet there's, when we go into the land of lawlessness, there seems to be no laws. That when we go into this bleak western landscape, we cross that river, there is a land of no laws. But that's not to say that there's not any laws of God, that there's not any sort of spiritual grander laws of the universe, and that making those right decisions sort of define you with being good or bad, or ultimately will have your comeuppance in a certain way. That the Coen brothers are interested in having this world that has a very sort of moralistic view, where even if you go into the land of the lawless, that you will suffer some sort of consequences. And there's spiritual elements of snake pits there on the film. You know, I don't want to spoil it, but the consequences, I mean, the final sort of 10 minutes of the film very much add to that melancholy element of the film, and what happens to them at the end is kind of telling. So I think the Coens in this film, especially with the spiritual elements, I mean, talk about leaning on the grace of God, and that's sort of a Christian theme that reprises throughout the film. I think just they're more interested in terms of what the cost of revenge is, and is it worth it, that Maddie keeps on going through this path, that she constantly sees death, but she has this tunnel vision, she has this stubbornness, that she continues to go forward into it, ignoring all the dead people and the dead trees and the dead firs, and that path to death, she ignores it, continues to go onto it, and then suffers a consequence. That even though she's maybe humanly just and right because this man murdered her father, that doesn't mean she can sort of to overtake God's will and is not relying on God's grace and not going to the arms of the grace of God, as the song suggests. Now, I also think the film works in a sort of mythical sense in terms of what a hero is. I think Rooster Cogburn's a very fascinating character, and I would extend this to sort of LaBeef too, because like I said earlier, that there is a stubbornness to him, there's an obnoxiousness to him. He will turn back at any chance. He often doesn't want to go back towards this, yet what makes him a hero at the end of the day is what he decides to do at the right moment. That what defines him as a hero, and say Ned Pepper as not one, is what he makes of the situation. That when push comes to shove, what does he do in the right situation? And does he work in self-interest, or does he work in someone else for compassion, or working with and helping out someone else? And that's sort of the divide we come here. That with the Western genre, it's seemingly black and white. There's the true grit original John Wayne, who's, yeah, he's kind of stubborn, but he's charming in that way, and he does the right thing because he's a hero and he has very few flaws. And then you have the anti-hero, which is kind of just a villain in Unforgiven, which I think have sort of blatant disregard for their characters, where they have really little redeeming factors except for the fact that they have a family. And sort of push and pull of either you're a really bad guy or a really good guy. But Rooster Cogburn is, you know, he's not an anti-hero because of his obnoxiousness or stubbornness, and he's not just a plain flawless hero because he has some of these elements, but those negative elements don't make him an anti-hero either. What makes him a hero, and sort of what's interested in this myth of the hero, meaning that the larger sense of what it means to be a hero is doing the right thing at the right time. And Rooster Cogburn is an interesting embodiment of that, because he's going to do the right thing at the right time, but he's going to make it hard for you to get there. And I think working within the Western genre, I think this movie also kind of comments that in a really unique way too. Which I also think you can connect back to the spiritual elements with Richard Cogburn, and he's doing this for Maddie. There's no sort of self-interest in him. He is sort of a compassionate person. So the larger question is, what is true grit? Is grit the sort of ability and tunnel vision to get what's done and finish the job, or is actually to have some sort of mercy to the justice, that there's sort of a compassion, that there's a grace, that the God element can sort of enter in as well? And there's lots of different interpretations, but this movie is very religious in that sense. And this is coming off of the Coen Brothers' A Serious Man, which is maybe their most overtly religious movie, constantly searching for that element. But it's the element of religion, going even back to Fargo and Raising Arizona, is strong throughout their films. But ultimately, the Coen Brothers, it's got the funny, smart dialogue in there as well. It's a linear story, yes, but it's more than that. It's highly metaphorical. You can interpret it as the coming on to adulthood, the sort of faith in a Christian God, the spirituality of that, of what is the cost of revenge, what is true grit, what does it mean to add God into your life. And then you could also interpret it in terms of the myth of the hero and the sort of subversion of that in a unique kind of hero that we haven't seen too often. Just a perfect movie that I wouldn't cut a frame from, and like I said, one of the Coen Brothers' best, and one of the best westerns, and the best western of the decade. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know your thoughts of True Grit. What do you think of my reading? Like I said, make sure you subscribe to the channel for next week when we go into the best horror movies, which is a series I've been working on for a while, meaning that I've been watching a lot of movies. I've been caught up. I've watched about, I don't know, I think over 50 movies, horror movies in particular, that came out this decade in preparation for this episode. So that's going to be lots of fun. One that's going to be lots of fun. That's about it, guys. Until next time. Stay tuned.